Hello YouTube. This is Neon. Yeah, this is Neon. This is compassionate listening, and addendum, I left out some stuff. I'm going to give you two situations, two scenarios when it comes to sharing, okay? Sharing personal and intense information about your life to someone else. One would be what society would consider mainstream information to divulge. Let's say you went on a honeymoon and you come back and you are talking to me, and let's say I'm a friend, and you tell me, hey Neon, we just got back from our honeymoon. Some appropriate things to ask you might be, really, where'd you go? Did you have fun? Maybe that's about it. That would be appropriate questions. They're not intrusive, not nosy. Inappropriate questions would be, did you have a lot of sex? Did you have sex every day? What kind of sex did you have? Did y'all mess around with any other couples while y'all was on your honeymoon? Did y'all do any group sex? Completely inappropriate. Why is that inappropriate? It's inappropriate because it's very mainstream to share that a person has been on a honeymoon. It doesn't give the listener the right to ask a bunch of inappropriate questions. Now I'm going to give you another example of something that is appropriate, but society does not deem appropriate to share. If I want to share that I was abused as a child sexually through incest, it's very common that I will be asked, what did he do to you sexually? Were you sodomized? What age was the perpetrator? Very intrusive, inappropriate, and nosy questions. So I want to let you know that with compassionate listening, from the speaker's point of view, if you are sharing information that is intense, that's impersonal, that's deep, that's very important to you, you don't have to answer people's questions and let them determine the amount of detail that you give. It's up to you to determine how much specifics and details that you want to divulge. Some reasons that people will ask these kinds of questions is because, first of all, they're not compassionate listeners, and they are trying to evaluate you, diagnose you, treat you, right? Deem legitimate or not legitimate your situation. They want to take control of the conversation. Now, there are polite ways of asking questions, which I will talk about shortly. They are likely to want to out-reason you in your own situation. They may want to blame you for these issues in terms of incest. They may be bored and just want to have something to gossip about, and they may just simply want to undermine and contradict. None of that is compassionate listening, but it is a typical way that people listen. They listen, and it's not listening, by the way. They listen with their mouth. They think about what the speaker's saying. They do all of these things that I just said, none of which are compassionate listening. And this is their agenda when you share something that is not deemed appropriate to be sharing. Because sharing incest is airing one's dirty laundry. And for the mainstream of the US, it's not appropriate to air one's dirty laundry. So unlike the honeymooners who share their information, the person who shares incest, because they're breaking that rule of airing their dirty laundry, I have found personally that I am deemed worthy of being asked a bunch of inappropriate, nosy questions, intrusive questions that's none of their business. It's happened to me many, many, many times. Now, when you are sharing information with somebody else, it's important to know that whoever is asking questions in a conversation is in control of that conversation and is taking control of that conversation. Very important to know, because that's a very typical response when a person is sharing something that's of much gravity. Okay, the listener a lot of times will begin to ask very probing questions where there's no end. This can be if you're sharing an invention. This can be if you're sharing an idea for a screenplay, for a movie, for a TV series, for an invention, for a play, people will begin to ask a lot of inappropriate questions. And usually the motives are not good. Because first of all, they have no right to try to set an agenda in the conversation as to how much detail is going to be divulged. That is up to the speaker. Beware that if, and I'm going to speak in terms of sharing incest and trauma, since we have to go through that 1 to 2 year process of incessantly talking about it in order to heal. And that's something that I went through. And it took me more than just 1 or 2 years because people kept abusing me in this way, trying to evaluate, diagnose, treat, deem legitimate or not legitimate, out-reason me in my own situation, blame me for the situation because they were bored and they wanted something to gossip about, or because they wanted to undermine and contradict me. An appropriate way, let's say we're friends, and I see you're not doing well, and let's say it is because you've suffered years of incest, and as an adult, you're now working through the psychological and emotional result, right, of that abuse. And so I see you and I say, how are you? And now let's say you, because I know you're not doing well, I can see it. And let's say you say, oh, I'm not well. Now what I would do, and this is an appropriate way of getting more information, is I repeat what you say. Oh, you're not doing well. So then you, if we're friends, you may choose to divulge, well, I am processing some childhood trauma. And I may be thinking, wow, what kind of childhood trauma? That's probably legitimate, but it's up to you, the speaker, to decide whether that question is legitimate or not. So now I can again say, oh, you're processing some childhood trauma. Now you may choose to say, yeah, I had been sexually abused for years in my childhood and I'm working through that. That should be enough information for me, in my opinion. But if I'm beginning to be nosy or maybe want to see if you'll divulge more information, I can say, oh, wow, you suffered from incest. And I may want to see, do you want to share more or not? That's a proper way of doing it. For me to ask you, really, were you sodomized? Really, how old was the perpetrator? People ask these questions because they want to, again, evaluate and they want to decide whether you were actually abused. They don't want to take your word for it. Again, you're airing your dirty laundry, you know, quote unquote. I don't agree with that, but that's mainstream society, is you don't share these kinds of things. Therefore, you deserve this disrespect. You deserve this intrusion. And you deserve me to ask the kind of inappropriate questions that I would never dare ask people, newlyweds, who just returned from their honeymoon. Okay? So, it should never turn into an interrogation if you were sharing your abuse with someone. Now, an issue with women who are sexually abused, and it's very unfortunate, very misogynistic in my opinion, that a lot of times they will be asked if, they will be asked if they were sodomized. They said that when it comes to women getting justice for child sexual abuse, and I believe this may apply to rape too, that a lot of times jurors, we're talking the average U.S. citizen, jurors, they're less likely to convict if she was not sodomized because they consider sodomy to be abnormal. And if it was just, you know, in an adult woman consensual context, if her abuse was that copulation, they're less likely to convict because in this warped logic that is not logic, that is perversity, they believe that women, heterosexual women, were eventually going to have copulation anyway. So is it really that bad? That's perverse, but there's a lot of people who believe that. So when women share their abuse, that's one of the inappropriate questions that people will ask because many people won't even deem your abuse legitimate. It's important to note that many women and men, as children, they may never have been touched as a child and they were sexually abused. They may have been forced to strip naked. They may have been forced to do things to themselves sexually. They may have been forced to pose and have pictures taken of them. There's many kinds of abuse that does not even involve touch, that is devastating. People have no right to try to judge whether you were abused or not because they're ignorant. They're ignorant. Now, again, because sharing one's dirty laundry is taboo, when you say, I don't want to give you that information, because they're going to ask inappropriately, they're just going to say, well, what happened to you sexually? And if you say, well, I don't want to go into that kind of detail, they'll blame you. Why? Because you're sharing your dirty laundry, therefore you deserve this disrespect. And they'll blame you. Well, you started the conversation, why don't you go all the way? Completely illegitimate. I would never say that to newlyweds. She would probably smack me and he would probably punch me in the face if I was asking about what happened sexually on their honeymoon. That's not taboo. Sharing incest is taboo. Therefore, many people believe we deserve that kind of intrusion and disrespect. Don't allow people to do that if you were sharing your abuse or anything that is important to you. Bunch of questions. Compassionate listening is not interrogation. Does not require a listener to ask a bunch of questions. I gave an example of how to do it appropriately, and that is with giving the speaker the right to determine what they want to share and what they do not want to share. You sharing childhood trauma, yes. So I kind of shared that already. Shared that about the wedding, the newlyweds. Here's in a situation where a conversation is me, let's say you asking me questions. This would be appropriate. A police interrogation, a job interview, a press conference, giving testimony in a court, a psych evaluation, a detective interviewing me as part of their investigation. That's appropriate. Sharing your incest or anything that's important to you where the listener now wants to start asking a bunch of probing questions and taking control of the conversation and intruding on your privacy, very different than a police interrogation, a job interview, a press conference, etc. It's not the same way. Now, one time someone at work had given me a ride home. And this was a point where I needed to talk about my mental illness and my incest incessantly. So he asked me a bunch of inappropriate questions. Have you had hallucinations? Have you ever felt like people are trying to attack you and then you want to attack? Inappropriate questions. And I thought he was genuinely interested and just curious and wanted to know more. And I was happy to divulge. Well, a friend of mine saw this guy later, and he was in holding for some TV production. And in holding, he had this group of people captivated by our conversation and how this crazy guy he gave a ride home to and all this stuff. This guy was asking me all of these inappropriate, titillating questions so that he could have something to gossip about. Protect yourself. Be discreet when you share your information. Don't allow the listener to start asking you questions and intruding on your privacy. In a similar manner, when it's an invention that you're sharing, or if it's an idea for a new script for a movie or play, etc., people will oftentimes ask you a bunch of inappropriate questions too. And what I have heard in Hollywood is that many times it's simply because they want to steal your idea. Happens all the time in Hollywood from what I understand. So this is some stuff that I left out of the first 6 episodes of Compassionate Listening. So be aware when you share, you set the limits, not the listener. When the listener tries to set limits, they're setting limits and intruding. They're intruding. That's not compassionate listening. That's setting limits, intruding on people's privacy and trying to determine how much information they're going to give out. Not appropriate. So, blessings and best wishes. If you like my video, please like, subscribe, share, comment commercials, recommend my videos. Do one or more of those things. Thank you.